Okej, nu kör vi igång. Okay, so hello and welcome to the Metaphysical Laboratory. This is our first episode in English. And today, and with us today we have Marcia Cavalcante Schuback, who is professor of philosophy at Södertörns högskola in Stockholm. She specializes in hermeneutics, phenomenology, German idealism, and the relation between art and philosophy. She has also translated Heidegger's Sein und Zeit into Portuguese. So the first question we usually ask in all of our interviews is the question of which three influences have left the deepest marks on your thoughts. And in one of your essays, you say that we live in a peculiar philosophical position, in where it is in some sense it's seen as shameful to live under another philosopher's influence. So I guess this is something of a twofold question. So which are your three major influences, and what is your relationship to these influences? I mean, is it a shameful relationship, or how would you describe it?
So hello, and then I say hello from Rio de Janeiro, just to remind that I'm here, confined and isolated. And so thank you for asking me to come to talk with you. And to your first question, the three influences. Nowadays, I think the meaning of teacher is rather influences. No? I think, I don't know, has been more and more. But I could say that, maybe strangely, but Pythagoras. And then I would say Heidegger. And then I would say Schelling. But if we consider the restricted scope of what we call philosophers, I mean restricted because there are many other thinkers that are not labeled as philosopher officially, so I just say three. And what about being ashamed of being influencer? Influence, I think it has to do with this idea that when we have receives an influence, that we are not very able to think by ourselves. But the problem is, what does it mean to think by ourselves? I think this is an important question, because we use, I see modern human beings and human cultivated, educated, I don't know, in an European manner, we would say that to think by ourselves is to think autonomously and very strangely, almost spontaneously, as if we could speak a language that was born with ourselves, as if we could think a thought that would just arrive or come from ourselves, as if we were completely from ourselves. And that's maybe a presupposition that is very wrong. So in this sense, if you just remake this supposition, we'd say that we never by ourselves, for the simple reason that we are born, for the simple reason that we are born in a language, in a memory, in a oblivion. We are born always with. So in this sense, we're never alone. And in this sense, we never think alone. No? So just to your two first questions.
So every time we have guests on, we always guess what influences they have. And this time we got one person right, which was Heidegger. But we also get Eugen Fink, who was a student of Husserl and Aristotle. So I was wondering what you think about those two guesses that we got wrong.
Yes, you didn't get wrong. You didn't get wrong. I understood your question that the three influences were three thinkers that open up. Every thinker, philosopher we read, I think, even the ones that are more far from us, they open us thoughts. They open us perspectives of thought. But you were right, because both Aristotle and Eugen Fink are important voices with which I talk, if you could phrase like that. And but I didn't said or name Plato. Plato, if you ask me otherwise, if you ask which are your first books of philosophy you read, because it was not at the university, it was quite before. So when I was 14, 15, the first book of philosophy I read was Plato Republic. You would say, oh, this was very influential because, of course, my desire to study philosophy, it recognized itself when I read Plato. But I didn't name Plato. I could have named Aristotle, which I read very extensively. But it's only because Pythagoras, for me, opened up the three very important connections for me in my own path of thought. It is music. It is mathematics in a more metaphysical sense, and philosophy. So that's why I said Pythagoras. I could have said Plato. I could also have said Aristotle because I discovered Aristotle through Heidegger, and it was very important, the reading of Aristotle. And Eugen Fink, it is for me a very important influence in the way somehow Heidegger and Schelling continue for me in a kind of transformation. So in this sense, the whole rephrasing of metaphysics, you call your laboratory Metaphysics Laboratory. And in this sense, we could come to this later, the very concept of meon, known being, from Pythagoras. And Eugen Fink has a strong concept of it. So you were right in your guess.
Thank you.
A question we also ask everyone we interview is what you think the role of philosophy is. Does philosophy have a special role to play? And maybe if we were to add a geographical aspect to that question, one can perhaps mention that about a year ago, the president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, was in the news for his attack on philosophy, and he claimed that philosophy was useless because it didn't generate any practical utility and should therefore be defunded. So what do you think the role of philosophy is?
Oh, this is a good question regarding the education, if you could say, education minister in Brazil, in the Bolsonaro regime, stated yesterday very clear in the Twitter or what, this internet thing, was saying, yes, education, it's very important. Yeah, you pay taxes, you working in the shops, you working in taxi drivers, and so on. But your money, what we want? We want doctors, we want engineers, you want people working in this, useful disciplines. But you don't need to study sociology, not anthropology. You don't need to study philosophy, pay with the money of the state. But if my son, he's a tremendous Bolsonarist, sometimes more than Bolsonaro, if it's possible. And he says, if my son wants to study philosophy, of course he is free. But I would tell him, I would embrace him and tell him, did you begin to work? Begin to work and pay your studies. So this is very precisely what you said 1 year ago. But for the geographical aspect, this is not only Brazilian and Brazilian under a fascist or new fascist regime. This is Sweden. This is Europe. This is modernity. This is contemporaneity. We had the elections in Brazil 2018 in October you have two turns. No? The first turns, it showed the danger that we realized, we from the other side, you could say, that there was a great, great danger that Bolsonaro and this new fascism would win. I worked 1 week in Sweden. I work in Sweden. I lived in Sweden, but not now. I'm here, cannot go home now. I work almost, I slept maybe 2 hours a whole week to set up a research project to stint the Institute for Internationalization of Education in Sweden, connected to art and theoreticians of literature and aesthetics and philosophy, to discuss the question of exclusion and inclusion. And this both as aesthetic practices, literary practice, intellectual, theoretical, and philosophical practice. It was a good project. I put it 1 week very hard because I need to do, I have to have a Brazilian university that does the same and apply to the correspondent stint in Brazil. And so, look, we made it 1 week involving people, bureaucracy, research projects. Hell. Bolsonaro won. The first thing to change all the people in these departments or institutions to just, make this new art of censorship, technical censorship. When the result come, almost a year later, in the new regime, I was certain that Brazil would say nay, and Sweden would say yes. What was the result? Precisely the contrary, because there were still people, good people from the university working in this institution. They said, yes, we get the highest grade. What did the stint said? No, only Naturvetenskap. Only sciences got the project in this joint program between Brazil and Sweden. So I profit our program, our discussion, to tell this story, because this is not only Brazil, but this is very hard now, because the project was destruct all the critical perspective, but critique is not done only human sciences. Critique is at the basis of nature sciences. So, for 3 weeks ago, I'm older than you. When I entered the university in Brazil, it was the year of the opening, we call, where the exiled intellectuals, nature scientists, the most important physicians working in physics, theoretical physics, and so on, they came back for the first time in 1979. And for 3 weeks ago, there was a homage to a very important physicist, I don't remember how to say in English, José Leite Lopes, quantum physics. And he wrote extensively. He was in exile because he was a critic of dictatorship. He was so philosophical. He knew and studied philosophy. And all these brilliant theoreticians in nature sciences, not the bureaucratics, they don't know, whatever they are, but they know that philosophy has the most important role for all sciences. You cannot be a good doctor if you don't understand what is the meaning of things you do. So philosophy is the most important discipline, not because of its very erudite knowledge, but because it is the exercise of thinking. Or the exercise of thinking is an exercise of life, the most important, I would say.
To move on to another geographical part of the world, and you mentioned Sweden quite a lot. About 10 years ago, you participated in the Swedish radio in a panel discussion called "Sweden, a Philosophical Developing Country," is the translation. And you often make the case in your writing that Sweden perhaps has this very modern, perhaps even anti-intellectual or anti-humanities culture that might be part of modernization in general. But our question is just, do you think the pandemic will have any effects whatsoever on this relation to philosophy? Do you think the pandemic will change that view of philosophy as a useless topic? Or
You mean the pandemic situation now, the corona pandemic?
Yes.
I don't know. I don't know if you can know now what are the effects. I think that we have a big danger now. That's my position. The danger is this, precisely what we're doing, zombie existence. Because I do think that what we need in our world more and more is presence. And presence means not to be there, but presence means to be there with your body. That means with your life. That means that you take positions. And that's very hard because the new capitalism or the new system, which is a techno-mediated capitalism, it is virtual somehow based on this. It is a system in which I can make a lot of statements in a Zoom. I can say against every politician and so on and so on. And this can remain a kind of parallel life while the governments, the big corporations are taking decisions. Of course, there are overlappings. I hope that this will increase. But I think that the only thing, when I see from the Brazilian perspective, which is a fascist government in the new way of fascism, controlled by all this internet and so on, what the main technique is you can say whatever you want, but the meanings, they become, through the medium, very ambiguous. What you say, can also mean this, and can also understand like this, and so on. So the problem of the fake news has to do with the medium, not only with the bad guys or bad girls also, they are making this ambiguization. So we have to understand that there is a danger. So the pandemic, I can see, has the danger of naturalizing completely the over-digitalization of the world. So everybody thinks, oh, of course it is more economic. For some, there are many problems, but I don't know how the world will respond to this year of suspension, maybe 2 years of epopee in this sense, suspension of the world. I don't know.
All right. We have read your book, Lovtal till intet. And in one of your essays on Nietzsche, you hint to his critique of Western philosophy, that it always tried to understand the alien, det främmande, in relation to the home-like, the egna, one's own. And you say that in a hermeneutical project, you must sacrifice one's understanding of the home-like sometimes to understand the alien. And to understand the alien on terms of the home-like is to do it injustice. So how do you think we ought to approach the current events in the corona pandemic when we are meeting a situation and a virus that is so alien and unhome-like to us?
Yes. A good question. I think that from this book, from 2011, to my last book that came out this year, Time in Exile, I think there is, I don't like the word development, but I think there are a variation, or I thought further, a lot of categories that I presented there. In this book, Untitled, the main hermeneutic category is the in-between. And what I try to show is that the whole discussions we have about in epistemological level, where you have to know an object, a subject, or a subjective, or a consciousness knows an object. And then you have a lot of discussions about the process of objectivation, the implicated subjectivation and subjectivism in this epistemological process. We have ethical, we have political, you have aesthetical, you have a lot of, formulations of how you meet the other or otherness. No? It can be an object, it can be a person, it can be a society, it can be a culture, it can be also a historical period, and so on. So you are asking how we meet hermeneutically the present. And the present, which is not only, the result of a past or the beginning of a future, maybe, we don't know, we never know, but it is the present in the sense of what is happening. And it's happening in such not only velocity, but we are so immersed in this wildness while it is happening, near done, that we have very much a lot of difficulty to understand what is going on. We are on in the going on, we could say. No? So what I made in this last book now from 2020, Time in Exile, was really a hermeneutics or attempt of a hermeneutics of the ongoing, or the pågående, or the wildness. So in this sense, it can be seen more theoretically as a kind of development of the concept of in-between, in which the in-between, that is somehow more space, more rumslig, more spacely, spatial, and the meanwhile, more temporal, they meet. So they are breaking with the linear succession that thinks the past, the present, and the future. So this is my attempt. So in this sense, I think that the pandemic is urging from us a thought on new categories to think the ongoing as such, while it is happening. So how to think that? So that's a little bit what I'm trying to develop in different levels.
Okay. Another interesting aspect of the pandemic is this very common talk of myths. So people say that it's a myth that you sneeze when you have corona, or that it's a myth that you inject hand sanitizer in your lungs and cure the virus, as Trump says. And myth is here contrasted with fact. So, and it's a reading that has deep roots in the distinction between mythos and logos. That is often mentioned when one talks about Plato. But you have argued that myths have another role to play in the pandemic. I mean, myths have to do with what we do not know and cannot know.
Yeah, I would say that when you talk about myth in the first sense, when you describe it as a myth, that has to do with the obscurantism. So let us say, take the big obscurantist together with Trump, but there are many others. The Bolsonaro says, no, Corona, this is a myth. This is only a small verschiebung. This is only a little cold. We could say that in this sense, this is not myth. This is mythology, and this is obscurantism. This obscurantism means, as some people now in Brazil came with this idea that the earth is plane, the earth is not round, because the earth has to stay. So if you have a round, you have the very symbol of movement, of eternal movement. Of course, this is obscurantism. So it is not only philosophy that is suffering in Brazil, also natural sciences, of course, but certain levels. So I would say this is not myth, this is rather obscurantism, this is mythology, this is the manipulation, also very typical of media. Media helped to do this. No? This is ideology, this is propaganda. So you have a lot of other concepts to connect with this. Of course, there is also an important concept or use of myth in the development of fascist and Nazist totalitarian ideologies. Now, this is another question. But the myth, I'm seeing positively, let us say, how Plato uses myth. I have precisely wrote a text about the myth of air in the Republic of the State, that it would be a number of iolas that my colleague Charlotte Weigel is organizing. And it was very nice to discuss this myth, because it is a myth of what's coming after. So precisely the question we are discussing, what's coming after the pandemic. So I try to read this myth from this question, what comes after death? Now, this is a question of myth, and Plato is known, Pythagorean, as also a philosopher who defended the transmigration of the souls, metaphysics, and then, so I thought this is a good moment to reread this myth and think about it. And it becomes more and more clear for me that for Plato, who make fake myths, because he constructed myths, Plato, sometimes he recreates and rewrites some older myths. We should read when the myth appears, and he needs a myth. He needs a myth when he meets the I don't know. And then in this sense, I would call more modern myth for literature. Maybe I would say poetry also as well, because he also was exposing poetry, but it's another discussion. It has to do with that, of course, but we can do a seminar on Plato somewhere. But he is saying, so literature and poetry, we live in the world of the ambiguity, as I can understand, ambiguity of all meanings. Even the meaning of fact is ambiguous. The most objectivity became ambiguous. And what we need against ambiguity is not facts. We know that the science as well, we have Tegner, he's with facts all the time, numbers. We believe in him because we believe more in Sweden than in Brazil, but we know that all these ciphers, they depend on statistics, and the statistics is always a sample, and you know that there are a blind point in every statistics, and you don't need to be a specialist to know that all facts are also somehow constructed under presuppositions. What I want to say is that against the mythology, the faking, the manipulation, the manipulative desire of manipulation, we need precision. No? So I have a wonderful doctor student, a poet, Gabriel Itkes. He's writing about the precision of poetry. So what we need, because in literature, the words must be this. We cannot have either this or that. So each word is precise. When Captain Ahab in Melville, Moby Dick, he says, fullness got full, became full. Galenskap blev galen. Precise. What happened now is this sentence. So I would say that in this point, we don't know. That's what Plato brings the myth. So we can save myth in this sense. A suggestion, an hypothesis.
With that, I think we can maybe move towards more metaphysical territory about questions about truth. And I mean, in your book, A Eulogy for Nothingness, you portray something of a dialectic between, on the one hand, Nietzsche's idea of the world as not a text, and the world as a text is an idea that has dominated the history of philosophy in the West for a very long time. And on the other hand, you have the pre-Socratic philosopher Anaxagoras, who is in some sense one of the first examples of someone reading the world as a text or as thought or as speech. And you have this very, very beautiful quote that the gods do not speak Greek, they speak worldish. So there seem to be two ways of sort of reading hermeneutics then. One of them is a sort of reading in of interpretation into a real chaos that is itself unspeakable, and the other one is a kind of reading out through interpretations of pre-existing meanings in the world as a text. Which one do you prefer?
You mean between Anaxagoras and Nietzsche? Maybe I'd say Nietzsche and Anaxagoras, or Anaxagoras and Nietzsche. The both I would prefer. I would be coming both to my dinner, to my symposium. There are so interesting things about the text, and you studied also ancient philosophy, as I could understand. No? And there is a passion for all metaphors related to text, to the alphabet, to grammar. Without to speak, I use very much, it's not a metaphor, but I try to not to do, but somehow it can sound like that we live in the gerundive time. So people like this, but they don't know what it's meant by. But it's how to say, it's seductive to all the concepts related to the world of the book. Also because we are European, Western, even here colonized and so on, but we are in the tradition, also Muslim, also the Jewish culture, the tradition of the review book. No? So also philosophy, maybe the Greek philosopher you're calling, it's only possible because of the written word. It's maybe the fight between philosophers and the poets in ancient world, between Plato and Homer and Hesiodus, is a fight somehow against the written words and the speaking. And Plato is dramatizing this in Phaedrus as well, as you know. So but I would say that there is a problem is that, and our word is, we talk about our contemporary word, digital word, as a visual word. We talk about visuocracy and so on, the ocular principle. But we forget that this ocular and this preponderance of the visual is the reading. And the reading is also strange because when we read, there is a silent voice when we read. Very difficult. Derrida talk about this silent elocution when we're reading. And it's happening. So there is something of a silent voice. The voice is still there. But what is also interesting is that when we read, we also are seeing signs. We are also seeing drawings. We are seeing marks that are very close to visual arts. Not very close, it is visual art as well. But we are somehow lazy because we read meaning. And we forget, as Nabokov said once, that when we read a text, we always reread, because the first thing we do is to read the drawing of these printed forms that we call an A, a B, a C, but they are forms, they are lines. We read lines. So in this sense, when we read lines, we are reading movements, movements that are fixed somehow. So we only have movements, but we fix them as the zombie zoo. No, zoom, it's fixed. But so this, I didn't answer your question about this, the word as a text, but I would say that it's very difficult to read the world because we read worlds. We always read singular events, moments, books, or whatsoever. The very notion, the very concept of the world is very mysterious. And then the question is how we see the world. We cannot see the world. How do we see the whole? But the world gives itself to us. So somehow the world speaks. This, for many philosophers, this sounds very mystical or very strange or very unscientific. It is, because science is not the whole truth of science. And then, so Nietzsche is more Anaxagorian than we think. And maybe Anaxagoras is more Nietzschean. Above all, because both Nietzsche and Anaxagoras, they understand that the most important concept related to the world is the being given. It is the gift that life is already given. And so we see, how does we know that we are alive? How do you know that? How we know life? World, these concepts. We cannot know as we know things in the world, or things, living things, but they are together giving. They are co-given. But what is co-given? It's the giving. That something is given. When something appears, the appearing appear as such. We see this in the theater. So this is the moment of the word. I think this was the great job of phenomenology and of Fink. Great job in that, to do that.
All right. Yeah, you talked about the world sort of being given to us, but it comes, I guess, with a certain amount of ambiguity. And you previously said we don't need more facts to combat this ambiguity, and all facts are constructed using presuppositions. And I mean, this has come into light a lot in the Corona crisis, with different interpretations, not only of the world in itself, about what the coronavirus, how to best tackle it, and what the virus is and consists of, but also about the ethical domain, about what we ought to do about it. So how do you think that we, is there any way of overcoming the differences in interpretations of the coronavirus, given that there are these ambiguities and we cannot maybe resort to facts?
I don't just to for the sake of clarity. Did I say we don't need facts? We need science. We need more than ever the good science, and of course, a lot of wonderful scientists. They are working very hard to understand this virus that is almost, how to say, for each one its own virus effect. It's very difficult to understand. But what about the corona's politics or the ambiguities you see, how to choose the better strategy? So we have to understand that I think the coronavirus or the pandemic is a moment in the world in which the molecular and the digital, they meet. They really meet, because all the discussions about the pandemic are virtual and they viralize. We have this word in English. I don't say how you say in Swedish. Viralisera. So the viralize, it means it contaminates digitally. So you listen this, and then everybody listen, and then becomes these discussions. Sweden has so many cases, and Norwegian has so many cases, in Italy, and so many deaths, and so many ones. So they becomes both competition of dates and numbers of death, of almost a stock, who have much and more. Different strategies are compared all the time. So you have the digital virus way of disseminating information, and the research and the effects and the death, the existential and physical experience, death and disease. So we have a lot of things. So of course we need science to speak that scientists are not important nowadays. We need science in its best, but we have to see the ethical and political implications of science working upon science as well. We have a lot of corporations interested in the vaccination and getting money. We have a lot of interest together, so we should understand the whole. It's very difficult. About this is one point. About the strategy, what to choose. We have also to see that the pandemic has shown even more clear what is very clear, shown everywhere: inequality. So not only in Brazil, where we have inequality, I have the luxury position. I can be in my home. There are a lot of people that cannot stay at home, because it's not like in Europe. We have poor in Sweden, in Europe, a lot of poor, but we have misery, and we have under misery in Brazil. We have the non-existing existing people. We don't know how many people. We have a very social difference very hard here. So we have inequality of conditions, physical conditions, economic, social conditions. And we have, of course, the refugees in Europe. Not so much talk about this because of the pandemic or the pandemic. We could keep all the discussions of refugees a little in epoche. Don't need to talk about this. It's horrible. We don't speak any longer about what's happening in Syria. Horrible. What's happening really, and not only because they are the suffering abroad, but because Sweden, for instance, is implicated in this, being the country which most welcome the refugees. Welcome, it's what we have to discuss this also. But so that means that we have to understand that the whole crisis of Corona is also a crisis in ethics and politics, and not only economy. It is a crisis of ethics and politics when ethics and politics are based on the economy and not the other way around. That would be our utopia today, maybe, I would say. So, not easy. So we need more and more. That's why I say philosophy and awareness and attention to the gravity of the situation. So the big problem is not where I'm going to bring my summer vacations. That's not the problem. That's nothing. So we can be at home. It's very beautiful. Sweden, very beautiful. But you have to cultivate also your soul. It's important.
Yeah. To bring in some more philosophy then, in all of these interviews that we've done, we often ask questions about metaphysical realism and anti-realism. For example, about whether ethical values can be objective or whether there are ethical facts or whether there can be alternative facts, for example. Sometimes I think you've hinted to in your writings that you're a bit critical to some of the way metaphysical questions are framed, and that they're using too abstract concepts that are not related to experience. Since we are in the metaphysical laboratory right now, I was wondering what is your view about metaphysics, and are the questions wrongly framed and perhaps too abstract?
Yes. I was very happy when I read that you call it Metaphysics Laboratory, because when I teach it in Brazil at the University of Federal de Rio de Janeiro, until I left to Sweden, I had my room I share with my colleague and very good friend. I invited him for some years ago to Sweden, Jovan Fogel, and we had our metaphysics consultation room. So it was also a laboratory. So I was happy to read that. It reminded a lot of time many years ago, more than 20. But what I would say is metaphysics. Metaphysics, somehow we could say that the human soul is a metaphysical soul. And I really don't understand how is it possible a world without metaphysics, but I cannot understand how is it a world with metaphysics also possible. So I would say, I'll try to explain that. Metaphysics, so the word means, the Greek word, beyond the physic. So beyond the physic can be understood in many ways. Language, it's beyond the physics somehow because it is physical, because we have talking, we have a sound, written, we have paper and ink and print and whatsoever. We have also what we could call physics, that is somehow materiality, physicality, something that we, with our senses, we experience an otherness. we could say somehow. Leibniz would talk about materia as resistance, so we could say. Beyond, but language is also meaning, and you cannot take meaning like this, even if meaning are embodied, incorporated as a culture, as a strategies for policies or whatsoever. This is metaphysics. Metaphysics is not only superstitious, religious superstitions, and so on, but metaphysics is very dangerous, as all theory is dangerous, because we need to live the world, the everydayness, in order to not only to understand everydayness in a distant perspective, to see more, to see better, to see the whole, or what we call the whole, but we need to take a distance in order to go back to everydayness. This is the allegory of the cave. In Brazil, we have a beautiful expression in Portuguese. We have to fall into reality. We are in reality, but we have to fall. Cair na real. So, and that happens because in every day we are totally immersed in familiarity. You don't think all the movements you do in order to brush your teeth. It's a whole system that is involved. But we even forget that our heart, you cannot command the movement of your heart. You can command the movement of your legs. I can stand up, sit down, but I cannot say to my heart, stop, or beat if I fall in love, or if I am afraid. Yeah? So we have a lot of systems, involuntary, voluntary, reflexive, and so on. But in this sense, we are immersed in a lot of knowledge and a lot of understanding. But we don't understand that we are understanding. We don't see that we are seeing. We don't see that we are seeing. We don't say, it's very difficult to say, if I try now, to say that I'm saying. In this point, you have a kind of intensity of life, of all these systems of life. In this point, I would say is a metaphysical point. But it is very dangerous because you can get such a distance that you cannot connect any longer. You can become mad, you can become, I don't know, you can get totally outside of the blue, or you can be so indifferent. So there is a danger in theory. You cannot be too near, you cannot be too far. And this point is always changing, always being negotiated. And I used to use the metaphor of an egg. I think Kafka is an author like that. He writes in the only point where the egg can stand. But it's only one point. Very difficult, very dangerous. So this is the danger of metaphysics, which is the difficulty to understand something from its limit. I think this is the best moment of philosophy, when philosophy is so strong, what to say, so radical. That's also the best art, the best literature, and the best person that is really acting, consider its own limit. And at this point, it's very dangerous because you can fall, not in the real, but in the abyss. Yeah? It is like you go like a tightrope, a dance lean, dance, not dance lean, a tightrope that you go. And it's very difficult, this limit like this. So this is metaphysics in the best. But metaphysics is very dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering. I mean, if we were to ask, like something we've asked other people, whether ethics is objective. I mean, is that a question that is wrongly framed? Does it rely on a false dichotomy between subject or object, or I mean, is that a question that makes sense even?
Yes, I'm sorry. It were a lot of questions there. The question of question, we have somehow a discussion between analytic and continental philosophy. We can talk more about that. But one moment is that ethics, because the desire to control human being for the good and for the bad. It's so terrible, because if you have to control yourself. If you control your ethical gene, we will never had extermination camps. But this means to exterminate before the extermination. We have to exterminate. But this control would be that I can count, and I can put in a system of the computer all the possible movements I could have in a dangerous situation and so on. But there is a difficult point. This is to control totally human being, in order to avoid that human being will make mistake. I would say this is the biggest mistake. This is control. This is extermination camp outside the camps, I would say. But of course, I'm not saying that people doing this, they are Nazi. But I mean, this is a Nazist desire. Does it mean that there are persons that are totally, how to say, good or totally bad? But we have to be very cautious about this desire of control, but it is for the good. No. What is the good? And what is the limit between the good and the bad? So, in this sense, I don't think we can quantify ethics. Neither I think that politics today, which is made more and more on the basis of what the political scientists more and more call for research, but I would call for utredning. There is a difference between forskning and utredning. So research and how to say utredning in English? I don't remember. Reports.
Yeah.
No, reports. So research is not report. Report is good for taking decisions, deciding this is the best politic and so on. You can do that. But this is not research. Research is something else. And this confusion is very bad for research. And it's very good for politicians. Because they say, oh, we have research. No, it's good for politicians, bad for research. So I think we have to see that political decisions based only on report and not on political life discussions, it's also bad politics. It can be working for some working countries that work by themselves, but it can be very pernicious for countries fighting to find or to reach a point of minimal democracy, as in Brazil. No.
Yeah, I think we're approaching the end soon, but we have two more questions for you, and one is related to ethics, as you bring up, and we find ourselves in a situation where many people are taking very strong ethical positions, not only about what strategy to adopt, but also now in light of Black Lives Matter, there are many people who are out protesting. And one thing that we've taken up in this series quite a lot is the relation between those kind of normative ethical stances and one's background metaphysics. And you talked about like the distinction between research and report, also on guiding one's decision. So how would you say, what is the relationship between the ethical decisions and more background abstract metaphysics?
I think the problem maybe with your question is the alternative. No? I think that it's a good thing that there are situations that you really need normative ethics. You have to really to take stands and have to take positions. And there are moments and situations that you also need to, in order to take some normative decisions, to really open up the question of normativity as such. You cannot let normative ethics be normative for the whole life. And this is the difficulty, I would say. It's very important to understand, for instance, solidarity with Black life matters all over the world, in Sweden. But Sweden has to understand that there are racism in Sweden, and this racism in Sweden, we have to take care of it. We have to act and be solidary with American racism. So against. So we have to be aware that we have a problem in ourselves for the most, or almost always, I would say. So this is very important for the thing. That's why the metaphysical dimension is important. Now to also understand why we are solidary, not to show up myself as hanging together in the internet or YouTube. Self-promotion. This is a problem. This is not ethical. This is a use and appropriation, merchandise of ethics. That's very dangerous.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a very quick practical question now. We're now at 1 hour 5 minutes, so I think we have time for one more question. So you can decide between two questions. One is about Plato, and the other one is about continental and analytic philosophy. Which one would you rather have?
I don't remember the question. What was the question about Plato?
Okay. So the question about Plato was about your reading about your reading of Plato, which is in some way
we have already talked about.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I guess the more immanentistic, sort of the opposite of how Nietzsche and Deleuze portray Plato as the person who divides the world of experience from the world of forms, and in Law of Tal that you turn that on its head.
How many minutes you give me to answer this very huge, enormous question?
Take as long as you like. Philosophy doesn't wait.
We can do like the question of the history of philosophy. We can connect both analytical continental and the Plato question. We could say that Whitehead, he used to say that the whole history of philosophy is a footnote to Plato. So somehow Plato. And Plato has to do with the metaphysical, the bad question of metaphysics, we could say, that is what is denounced by Nietzsche, which is the separation of the world in essential and appearing. Not to understand, to desire a world understood under one, under the whole, which is always a sacrifice, in very tragical sense of meaning of the term, a sacrifice of the singular, of singularity. And Plato would be blamed for that. The Platonic is not the Platonic love, but it is really the sacrifice of the singular, and that is what philosophy somehow is always doing, because philosophy is trying to conceive the universal, the general, universalist views, not particularism, not relativism, and so on. What is the big problem is the suffering, the want of Western culture, which is a philosophical culture, is the singular. That's why it's so difficult for Western culture to really, really see the other. So, and then I would be with that critic of metaphysics all the world long. And I think this is also a problem in analytic philosophy, because analytic philosophy is always um, interpreting the world, saying, I'm not interpreting, I'm just seeing. And but it's always through a sense, restricted sense of what is language. So it is the predicative language. It is the language that I can administrate somehow in a system of coherence, of correspondence, of verification, and because of this appeal of scientificity. And also there is aesthetic appeal in analytic philosophy, that is somehow this passion from Wittgenstein, which is a minimalist, very beautiful, and so on, all close to Beckett almost in a certain sense. So, but this is the problem, because unfortunately, life is very, very obscure. And how to face the obscurity of the night without electric lamps. And I think this is a gesture that we have to meet also the limits of life, of existence, of knowledge, of philosophy, of the Western culture as a gift. The limit is not only everything I cannot, it's also everything I can, but in a certain sense. No? So singularity, the language of singularity, the view, the senses of the singularity. I think it's what we need against the pandemonium of the world.
Okay,
sorry, you go.
Oh, I was just gonna say that we solved the history of philosophy in 5 minutes. Which must be a record. No, you go.
Okay, is it fine if I ask you one question?
Yes.
Yeah. So so I was just wondering. It seems to me that when one criticizes analytic philosophy, for example, by presupposing that it can sort of read the world out in objective terms, and that it can kind of, in a very unhistorical fashion, just approach the topics directly. One is also, approaching the topic directly and saying that this is not possible. Like one is placing outside the limits of knowledge that one says exists. That we are always historical and we cannot go outside that. So, I mean, someone who practices analytic philosophy would probably say that you are also, by that, trying to say something that you cannot say. You're attempting to go outside of language and go outside of history and criticize these unhistorical practices. So what would you say to someone who says that?
I think if I understood correctly, I think that maybe you could say that there is a struggle between analytic and continued philosophy in regard to what is meant with history. So we have also a different comprehension of history. We can understand history that we are a result, or we are born in a historical situation that is a present, the world, or we have also a background, that we are educated, we receive also language, we receive the times and the interpretation of times, and our presuppositions to think, to act, to sense the world, they are given historically. And this is true. This is also a dimension of history. But history is not only that. History is also the, how to say, the task to engage with the past. This is also history. So history is not only the past, history is perhaps even more the present, because whatsoever notion of past we have, the past is always in relation to. We don't have a past in sich as a thing in itself. The history is relation. This is the most important concept of history that I think is more somehow followed or discussed in continental philosophy. But I think today the most part of continental philosophy, they are historicists. It's very, very rare that you really find a phenomenologist that make phenomenology. The phenomenologists make the history of phenomenology. They discuss what Husserl said and what Eugen Fink said and so on to keep the tradition alive, of course, enriching it, as the analytical philosophers are very continental. A lot of analytic philosophers are studying the medium Wittgenstein, the history. I have my very good friend analytical philosophy here, and because of the hell we're living, we have conversation about the Pelehermeneias of Aristotle every Saturday to discuss the problem of ambiguity and univocity in language. So in a certain sense, it's continental, making history of philosophy. But this is not the problem. This is very superficial. The problem is how we understand the fundamental meaning of history. One is that history is the past. Det är historia, we say in Swedish. And the other, that history is relations. In this sense, history is medvaro, mitsein, that is being with. This would be maybe just to make something very complicated somehow more simple. Yeah? But this is a different views. And sometimes I think that the analytical, I was really researching, but I didn't have time or interest to write a long article about that. That when the first time that the expression continental philosophy came out, and discussing with some colleagues in America and England, I discovered that the first time might have been in the circle of Stuart Mill. And Stuart Mill, in the political moment, this is very interesting. Maybe I profit the time to have this, because I'm not having time to write this article. But Stuart Mill was in his circle of conservators. They were very afraid of the poet Coleridge, because Coleridge had a very secret society, very subversive at this time, danger, because he proposed a socialist society. And Coleridge, as you know, he was very influenced by Kant and the transcendental idealism. And then Stuart Mill said, because they wanted to gather and expose Coleridge from England. And they said, no, we do not that. We invited him to discuss. We are going to learn all his arguments for defending this very dangerous socialism. And then we use this argument against him, because he comes with continental ideas. He comes with a continental philosophy. And this continental philosophy was Kant. So we can say, a lot of people agree that maybe the mark between continental philosophy and analytical is related to Kant. Maybe could even go back to Descartes, how we read this this Descartes and Kant were read. But maybe the political situation of being feeling oneself threatened by this subversive could be interesting to reread this first denomination. I'm not saying in Brazil, the most part of analytical philosophy, they are very links, they are not reactionary, and so on. But there is a political problem in this discussion that normally is disregarded.
Wow, that's very, very interesting. But I think we'll have to stop now. And thank you so much for participating. It was a very interesting conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as well.
I enjoyed it very well, and thank you very much. So nice to meet you too.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Goodbye.
Bye bye.